Okay, so I think we're ready to start our event today. Thank you. On behalf of the Western Library's reading series, I'm pleased to introduce Barry Grough, author of Juan de Fuca's Strait and Other Sagas of the Northwest Coast of America. As a former associate professor of history at Western, Grough was influential in developing the Northwest Archive Center and the Canadian American Center with Larry DeLorme and James Scott. In addition to his book on Juan de Fuca's Strait, Barry Grough has authored several other books, including his 2015 The Elusive Mr. Pond. And by the way, those books are on sale toward the back there, autographed copies. Barry will discuss the traditions of marine art and the value of portraying such sailing craft in our own times in his talk titled Sailing the Waterway of Forgotten Dreams, Art and European Vision on the Northwest Coast in the Age of Juan de Fuca and His Successors. Grough will take Bellingham maritime artist Steve Miles' paintings as his illustrative text, and an exhibit of Steve Miles' watercolor prints is on display in special collections through the end of winter quarter, which I think you've noticed out there. This event is co-sponsored by Western Libraries and Western's Department of History.
Thanks. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for the warm welcome. Many tributes to be made to Tamara Belts, first initially when we got this started, to Elizabeth's support, to those others in the library who have made this possible, to the History Department who's given assistance for this, for our hosts in Bellingham and Semiahmoo, we give grateful thanks, to the warm welcome that has been given to myself and to Marilyn. And in particular, I want to thank my dear friend Steve Mayo, the distinguished marine artist whose work is hung in the entry halls coming into this room. Please take time to look at those splendid appreciations of art and seafaring and nature. And also a particular thanks to the fixer, Kim Davies. Now Kim, he appeared on my doorstep about 10 years ago now, looking for books on Northwest Coast history. And he had already made a big scope of with his interests to locate the best marine artists in the Northwest, some of whom were dying off quickly, unfortunately, at that period of time. We stopped that trend. Our best marine artists now, Steve Mayo and Gord Miller on life support, but we're going to keep them going just as long as we possibly can. And when I was here about a year ago now, I would think, I said, you know, to Tamara, I said, we've got to get Steve's paintings up on the wall, and we know the guy who can bring that off. So we've started the cataloging and the providing of captions and the evocative material and the descriptions for Steve's collection. And to Kim, we owe a great amount of thanks. You know, ladies and gentlemen, nothing happens in a vacuum. Somebody's got to pick it up, somebody's got to move it forward, but some good idea, and I claim credit for that at least, getting it started and then finding the right people to carry it on. So here we are, about a year after the idea was broached, and here we are not only celebrating Steve's great achievements, but get a chance to talk about the voyages of the waterway in the waterway of forgotten dreams. But before we do that, I want to give this card to Steve Mayo. It's a card of appreciation. It's been signed by many of us in this room. If you haven't signed it, please give it to get your signature on it. You've heard of the item, the Kraken, the famous monster of the deep that comes up to grab ships. Well, this is the Kraken grabbing Steve Mayo's ships. And it's with our thanks and appreciation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Gary.
It's a pleasure. not least in the way of thanks, and on the long list of thanks, is Jeff Stevenson, who's gracing us today in the back there, in the back row. This is my beautiful Marilyn on the bowsprit of Taeko 4. We're about to enter Princess Louise Inlet, or Desolation Sound, last September. And here's Marilyn looking at the majestic scenery of our inlets and coasts of the Northwest Coast, and particularly the Great British Columbia. These are the waterways of forgotten dreams. Some of them were discovered very late in the 19th century, when steam navigation and hydrography was able to enter into those places. But many of them had been first seen by George Vancouver, Alcala Galliano, and Valdez, Caetano Valdez, in the year 1792. And indeed, the waters south of the joint, that means a combination, Spanish and British discoveries of 1792 had really been commenced as early as 1788, when the British maritime fur traders coming out of Barkley Sound and Nootka Sound moving south. And most of the discoveries on the Northwest Coast are always done from north to south and not from south to the north. It's just by virtue of the winds, the currents, and the tides. It's an observation I worked up after some thinking about this. But sailing out of Nootka Sound and sailing out of Barkley Sound and then moving into the entrance to the Strait of Juan de Fuca was the actual discovery by Europeans, at least, and that comes in 1787. Very quickly after that, the maritime fur traders, British and American, Robert Gray in particular, enter it, and before long the Spanish, finally realizing that somebody's been poaching into their backyard that they've never bothered to explore, I should point out, send in 1790, 1791, and then 1792, 3 successive investigations to see what the British are doing on the Northwest Coast. Now, ironically also, this is also by way of preface, the Russians were the first to gain strong footing in North America, in Alaska, and they were moving south. And the Spanish had heard of this from their expeditions there in 1774 and 1775. So thinking that the Russians were going to be arriving at Nootka Sound, Vancouver Island, the Spanish went to Nootka to intercept the Russians, only to find the British were there. And so we've got a complicated scenario that's working itself out in these waters. The voyage in the waterway of Voyages in the Waterway of Forgotten Dreams is the subtitle of Juan de Fuca Strait. The reason for that is that in the 1500s and 1600s, there were several postulations about a Northwest Passage. There was the Strait of Anian, or Anian, which had been proposed early on. Maldonado had produced another scenario of a passage. Juan de Fuca Strait was a third one, and there are 2 or 3 others. And in a long appendix to Fortunes a River, you'll find the 5 of them set forth and argued out as to the importance of the various postulations. As some bright spark once put it, this was the theater of all geographical postulations. This was the theater of all geographical postulations. Now, one of them, and the primary one to my way of thinking, was that of Juan de Fuca, a Greek-born mariner in the employ of the King of Spain, who claimed that in 1592 he'd made a voyage that entered the Strait of Juan de Fuca, had gone for several weeks through various islands, met various First Nations and Indians, and had almost gone to the Atlantic, and then he'd made his way back and ended up in in San Blas. Acapulco would have been a good spot. In any event, this was his claim, And he gave it as testimony to an English trader by the name of Michael Locke. And he did it in Venice in the year 1596. So the story is very strongly supported by this wonderful testimony and the wonderful correspondence that went on between the two of them from that time forward. Chasing forward the clock, 1625, this story is published for the first time in a successive volume to Richard Hakluyt's, and then after that time it becomes part of the literature of finding a Northwest Passage. So the voyage in the waterway of forgotten dreams is not really appreciated and learned until the Spanish and then the British come here in the 1780s and 1790s. These explorations always have a charm to any serious student of it, because these voyages and the ships and sailors are provisioned from thousands of miles away. The ships have to be stowed and properly provisioned. They have to have the food and drink on board. They're probably carrying livestock of some sort and chickens. They need food for that sort of thing. They need artillery. They need guns and ammunition, which has to be kept dry. They need the right kind of diet to avoid debilitating scurvy, which is the gray horror of the seas. And not least, they need splendid navigational skills, which is not easily learned. But in the time we're talking about, the chronometer, that is to say the 1790s, the chronometer was now in ready use, but most mariners of that time were doing stellar observations and using the nautical chart and nautical tables to determine their longitude and latitude. So the haven finding art was very, very well developed at the time the exploration occurs in this part of the world. Now that narrative is told in Juan de Fuca Strait, and I'm not going to repeat it again. And you'll find versions of it in some of the other works that I have. And incidentally, thanks to the curators in this section of the Wilson Library, because in the left-hand panel at the back there, in the second row down, and even the third row down, you'll see all my books that have been put on display there, with all the beautiful photographs that the publishers have allowed me to include in them. So please have a look at those. Interestingly enough, some of the illustrations in that book, first of all, the Royal Navy and the Northwest Coast, and then Gunboat Frontier, are photographs. But what we're talking about here today is in the pre-photograph era. So we're drawn back into a subject of art and imagination that commands our attention and is a compelling thing to me, because we have to search back into the intellectual origins of art and how it bears on the questions of science, and how art and science intersect between the imagining and the reality of things. So what I'm going to be talking about today, and showing a few slides along the way, is in effect an exercise in intellectual history. By way of preface then to more formal remarks, First Nations or American Indian art and artistic creation, as well as concepts of nature and mythology, are sadly not included here in my talk, though they have been the subject of many books and other appreciations. The very complexity and dynamism of them attracts our attention. But here today we are drawn to the art and imagination of the newcomers, the intruders into that native time and space. Against the great panorama of splendid nature that existed on the Northwest Coast in the third quarter of the 18th century, a hard-nosed empiricism was working itself out. The empirical observation of nature, exemplified in the keeping of ship's logs, of seamen's journals, was an established part of British maritime practice a great many years before the foundation of the Royal Society in London in the year 1660. This is according to the great authority on this, my late friend Bernard Smith of the University of Melbourne. And from its inception, says Smith, the Society placed a high value upon the information to be gained from such logs and journals. The information they contained included not only verbal and numerical data, but also graphic records in the forms of maps and profiles of coasts. That greatest master mariner, James Cook, answered to the Admiralty and to the King's regulations. The naturalist Joseph Banks, who sailed with him to Tahiti in the year 1768 and became the doyen of British science, answered to an entirely different calling. His was the age of empirical science, the age of enlightenment, so-called, and Banks was also influenced by the Society of Antiquaries, founded in the year 1750, which sought to bring habits of close observation, description, and explication to the study of the past, especially as revealed by its material remains, in order to place the rewriting of history upon a firmer and more objective footing. Thus, in Cook's voyage, important steps were taken to advance the techniques of objective observation and recording. Trained observers, and on occasion scientific observers and professional artists, were employed. Thus, in George Vancouver's voyage to this coast, 1791 to 95, the remarkable genius Archibald Menzies, surgeon and botanist, kept a prodigious journal. And in the politics of that journal, and in its non-publication, we have an example of the pulls and pushes that went on between the Admiralty on the one hand and the Royal Society on the other. And in this instance, Banks's prodigious power did not triumph over that of the Lords of the Admiralty, and Menzies' journal was not published in consequence of this. The Hakluyt Society will publish the definitive journal of the Menzies Journal, a definitive edition of the Menzies Journal under my editorship in about the year 2019, should I live so long. We see in that wonderful film, Master and Commander, the tensions that exist between the scientific and the belligerent. Stephen Maturin represents the scientific. Please put me ashore. Let me look at the iguanas. Captain Aubrey says, no, there's a French ship in the offing. We've got to go after it. And that tension that we see in Patrick O'Brien's Master and Commander, as worked out in that film, is exactly the sorts of thing that was exerting itself on our coast as well. Because Vancouver had his own requirements, Menzies wanted to do otherwise. Now, fortunately, Captain Vancouver was a little more agreeable than Captain Aubrey is to Dr. Maturin, but the same principle holds true. And at the end of the voyage, when the Discovery and Chatham returned to London, Menzies' journal is seized by the Admiralty, so it will not fall into the hand of Sir Joseph Banks. So what we're talking about here is an interesting dichotomy. Some promoters of exploration are wanting to back the empirical work of and the hydrographical work of the Royal Navy and the Admiralty. The others are answering to the empire of science. And I think that's an interesting thing. The Pacific Ocean, of course, in this era was the last of the great ones to be examined closely, and it contains not only extensive littoral, but also a vast number of islands and many archipelagos. Among these are Patagonia, the Sandwich Islands or Hawaii, Tahiti, Easter Island, the northwest coast, the Gulf of Alaska, Kamchatka, Melanesia, Polynesia, and various other islands. So it's not surprising that the the Royal Society and the Royal Navy coming to this new world were excited by the prospects of all the different peoples and all the different geographical and geological conformations that existed here. The remarkable diversity of the Pacific excited everybody's imaginations. That's why, of course, Cook's voyage and George Vancouver's after it, and La Perouse's voyage and the Russian voyages after that, brought such international attention to the reading public that was interested in the widening, expanding knowledge of the great chain of being, the knowledge network of the time. And the thinking in the 18th century and the early 19th century is, how does everything fit together? How is humankind, how is the physical world being brought together in this great chain of being? So these voyages that came to our coast were extraordinarily important in filling in a very large gap in the knowledge that existed there. When Cook went to the South Pacific to observe the transit of Venus, he carried instructions to report on all the natural productions and native peoples. He also had other instructions, but in essence, he was going as a naturalist. Within the limits, the native observers could supply artifacts and would trade items to those aboard ship. But the best thing to do for the Admiralty was to have on board a naturalist who might double as a surgeon, or to have an artist or a draftsman on board. Because at the end of the day, the draftsman would have to do the elevations would have to be made into etchings for the publication in the book, the drawings of harbors, the hydrographical hard work that was done in harbors, straits, entrances, and so forth, that had to be properly drawn, and then it had to be converted through the processes of engraving so that they could be made into charts, so that they could be sold. That's the process, and that's the process that in effect still continues to these days. So observation of the natural world was important for safe navigation. And on the profit and power of the British Empire depended good ships and safe navigation. Now, just one more thing before we have a look at some slides. The Royal Academy was founded in the year 1768, the same year of the Royal Society. These events intersect. There was much artistic thinking in Britain that recognized neoclassical theories of Italian origin, and French theorists had brought to the United Kingdom their own views of what art ought to be. And you'll remember that Rousseau dreamed of the Pacific with its wild and untutored persons being the best embodiment of civilization before it was somehow corrupted by other measures that were brought to it. That idealistic concept of the South Pacific and Tahiti died a very, very quick death, but it was very strong in the imaginings of Europeans that this was a beautiful world that was only going to be victimized by future visitors. Nature was to be rendered by the artist in perfect forms. It was not to show its imperfections. So if you look at William Hodges's paintings of James Cook's first voyage, you'll see magical scenarios working themselves out. There's very little violence in there. There's no horror stories. It's an Illyria, right? It's a gorgeous place of beauty and mystical in its beauty as well. The perfect forms may be gleaned from the masterpieces of the ancients and their Renaissance disciples. So the Royal Society approached nature a little bit differently, more graphically, more fluidly, taking liberties, appealing to travelers, appealing to virtuosi, appealing to scientists to take observations carefully and to use that as the basis for what might be brought down for the future. So the art world of 18th century Europe was looking to the Pacific as somewhat of an idealized place. The Admiralty, my friends, looked on it totally differently. They were concerned with mathematics and statistics. The Admiralty was the greatest statistical gathering organization in the world. The details they built up about the seas, its depths, currents, tides, navigational details, and more was all empirical, hard-driven facts. The Admiralty was the master of fact and not interpretation. This was the world of James Cook, and it was the world of all who sailed with him then or those who came after. The long list would include William Bligh, Henry Roberts, John Mears, James Colnett, Charles Duncan, George Vancouver. And it's worth keeping in mind that midshipmen were trained in the arts of draftsmanship. For the camera, we need to remind ourselves, had not been invented. As Captain Michael Barrett has explained in his brilliant book on the Serras, the father and the son, who drew both the French coastlines during the French naval blockade during Napoleon's War, this was material and insights that could be used for strategic value in bringing a close blockade to the French and ultimately defeating the French as they did at Napoleon's ending. On the Northwest coast, to bring it home to us, our first art, other than First Nations art, is invariably naval art. The British naval tradition is that has already been described. And it bears mentioning, however, that the Spanish tradition did not accord fully with the British. It was more imaginative in the sense of it being less realistic or less factual. Imagination and artistic license along the French or Italian or Spanish or Mediterranean traditions that I previously described was very, very common. Thus, if you look at illustrations of Alcala Galiano and Caetano Valdez's voyage, and I brought a catalog of that to show you, which I can do at a later time, you will see that the artist takes a greater degree of liberty with the art forms and even the landscape than did those hard-nosed Brits who were trained for factual observation for political and strategic purposes. We're charmed by the freedom of the Spanish illustrations. We delight in their romantic observations that often take us away to another time and another place. But it was remarkably in the requirements because of our history, which was so short and it was so heavily dominated by the successors of Captain Cook, that we're looking at a very empirical and very factual nature of our environment as shown through the art of that time. We say goodbye to the beautiful Marilyn, and we're going to go to the chart, a section of the chart, the celebrated chart of Captain George Vancouver of the coasts of Northwest America, published in the atlas accompanying his voyage of discovery, published in 1798 in 3 volumes with a separate atlas, with inserts of Discovery Bay, right? That place, wonderful place, went through several name changes, Puerto de Quadra at one time, and the entrance to the Columbia River as not discovered, but determined 100 miles up from the Columbia Bar by Lieutenant Broughton in HMS Chatham, the brig Chatham. And here we have details of one of the bays and harbors and estuaries. You'll see that Vancouver Island is faked in here with some eminences. Nootka Sound is here and Barkley Sound as well. The passages of discovery to the waterway of Forgotten Dreams come this way and then in here. Now this is fudged here. The southern end of Vancouver Island, my house is right there incidentally, but it's all been fudged. But in essence, you've got a wonderful tremendous detail here of Puget Sound, Hood Canal, and the like. And let me point out too the famous Cape Flattery, which was so important. Captain Cook did not think there was a strait here. He passed it by, admittedly in heavy weather, but he thought that the only fools would believe that there was such a passage. So he went from here, and on the 28th of March of 1778, he found a convenient harbor at Nootka Sound and entered it there. I pointed out then, and I'll point it out later to you now, that he went to Nootka Sound by accident. He didn't know it was there. He might have gone to Kukwat Sound or Clayoquot Sound or Barkley Sound, but Nootka Sound was the place. It was growing dark. He needed a home port, needed wood and water, and they went in there. But this is the fabulous chart. I think every university in Western North America ought to have this in the foyer. It is just a fabulous representation of what the world was then. You can see also on this map, this is Hanover, New Hanover, which was named for King George III, the House of Hanover. And if you could see farther south on a similar chart of this, you would see Nova Albion, or New Albion, which Drake had given to the name of this part of the world in the year 1579. Another story for another time. These are elevations along the lines of the Saris, father and son, that I mentioned before. They are views of land on the west coast of America, westward of Cook's River. That's up in Alaska. And they run, in essence, from top, and then you pick it up here, and there's one of the great volcanoes there. Would that be Mount St. Elias? And here we have another view of it from the other side. Now, this was originally drawn by none other than the dreaded William Bligh, who was a marvelous hydrographer and an excellent surveyor. But when the book was published of George Vancouver's, this appeared with the credit being given to Henry Roberts. That made William Bligh even more disgruntled than he normally was. Roberts shared in the royalties from the sale of this book. So these are our first quote-unquote photographs of the Northwest Coast, and they are truly marvelous. Here's Henry Roberts, master's mate on board HMS Resolution under Captain James Cook. Esteemed friend of George Vancouver, they were shipmates on that voyage. He was to have commanded HMS Discovery on what later became the George Vancouver voyage, but was succeeded by George Vancouver. What happened to Roberts? He sailed to the Caribbean and he died of yellow fever. We look now at some of the drawings as opposed to the engravings that deal with James Cook's visit of the Resolution and the Discovery to Nootka Sound in March and April 1778. When they came in to the entrance to the harbor, the leadsmen were sounding the lead lines and they couldn't find any depth or any bottom. So if you couldn't find a place to anchor, you're going to have to send hawsers ashore. And this is indeed what they did. And they came into Ship Cove, which is on Bligh Island in Nootka Sound, and they ran the hawsers ashore. This is the Resolution here on the left, and the Discovery. Now you can see, if you could see better, you would see that it's being dismasted and a new stick or mast is being replaced. You can see the observatory, which is being set up on the rock, and you can see some of the sailors assisting those who are setting up the observatory. First thing ashore, set up the observatory. You've got a clear day, you sight the stars. You determine your longitude, you determine your latitude. then you adjust your chronometers or check them against your chronometers, and you might well have to make an adjustment of this. We're not as happy with this illustration as it could be, but I'll tell you what it is. It's in essence the same location, and this is Nootka Sound, and we have, in this case, some First Nations activity here, and a beautiful stern view of this. This is by John Weber, W-E-B-B-E-R, who was the noted illustrator that was taken on James Cook's third voyage. Now, Bernard Smith's wonderful book, which I've been citing, European Vision in the South Pacific, European Vision in the South Pacific, 1768-1850, says that Weber's problem was that he put in all too many details, and that's fair enough, but we're happy to have them. Thomas Headington also sailed with George Vancouver, and here we are in higher latitudes, Icy Bay and Mount St. Elias, the Discovery and the Resolution approaching a magical scape here. Yes, we've got volcanic eruptions going on, but in this particular painting we have the spreading of the wings by the artist a little bit more. There's a little more fantasy there, I think, than reality, but looking at such an environment as the Alaska coast in those latitudes was bound to excite just about everybody else. And this was obviously not taken from a float plane, so Thomas Headington was imagining what this looked like because he was on board one of those two ships when this drawing was made. Here's another view. Sorry it's a little dark, but this is the coast of Nova Albion. This is Drake country, Francis Drake country. And this beautiful little vessel is John Meares's trading vessel, 1788. Illustration also by John Meares, and it shows up later to be engraved and appears in his book. A beautiful and handsome piece of art indeed. Of a different sort was Siggy Backstrom's views of the Spanish fort at Nootka in the year 1783. He happened to be, 1793, excuse me, he happened to be there on a trading vessel, and inquisitive chap that he was, he decided to take all down the details of the fort. There's the great Spanish flag. There's a ship on the ways being repaired. There's perhaps a chapel or an Indian house there, and this is the view of the Spanish fort and cove at Nootka, with other details added in. And a detail of this. Now this is an extraordinarily important piece in terms of military history. And the Catalan Guard was the one that kept the guard at this particular time. This was Spain's last desperate attempt to show the flag at Nootka Sound. It was a very short-lived attempt to maintain their suzerainty and power there, and they were squeezed out of it by what happened in the Nootka Sound crisis. But it makes a dandy chapter in all of our Northwestern history. And sad to say, and I've said this 1,000 times and nobody seems to be paying attention, in our Canadian history we have lots of hours and hours of important history talking about Irishmen in Newfoundland and French in the Belle Provence, but do the Spanish in our western portion ever get a mention? No. Another beautiful watercolor, this one an illustration from George Vancouver's voyage in Puget Sound. Beautiful illustrations of longboats here and tents being set up for rest and repair, and related to that to another place of observation and an observatory, Freshwater Bay Observatory Point west of Discovery Bay, or was it east of Discovery Bay, by John Sykes. A beautiful illustration, and this has been many times reproduced. Oh, engraving is beautifully spelled, Barry. I'm sorry about that. This by John Sykes. I think this is so charming. You see here these posts, and in Victoria's coast, this would also exist. Nets being put up to catch birds flying. That might have been one of the reasons. There may have been other reasons. But look at this beautiful headland, this white chalk headland. And you know, the English were enchanted by this here as in California and on the coast of Oregon because it might have resembled something of the south coast of England. But here's a long boat, these fellows looking in wonder at this environment. Now you got to be careful in being taken away by the wonder of looking at the environment. All these poor unfortunate sods were working under the king's regulations. If they went to sleep on the job, they might get 36 lashes. They might be demoted. Pay would be held away from them. They wouldn't get their rum ration and so forth. So isn't it odd when you look at an ideal landscape like this and you realize what traditions and requirements they were working under for the king's regulations? Discovery on the rocks. This is Queen Charlotte Passage, the northern end of Vancouver Island, and intriguingly, hydrographic survey ships have the occupational hazard of going ashore, and that happens in changing tides, and very quickly, too. This is the Discovery here, and that's the Chatham, and within an hour or two of this happening, it happened to the Chatham as well. So they were used to the modes of survival and happened to manage it. Here, First Nations canoe, another one, wonderful representations of life, indigenous life at that period of time. Moving on, it becomes a colored illustration. Manby, if I remember correctly, a very providential circumstance, said Vancouver, because the ship was able to be saved and righted and to sail another day. Here is an illustration, the coming-of-age celebration of a princess at Nootka in the year 1790. And Brother Kim, can you help me as to who the artist was in this? I cannot recall, nor could I find it.
I think this is the Spanish.
It is the Spanish,
Yeah.
yes. Is it Echeverria? Would that be?
Or
Soria. My point in
Echeverria.
Echeverria. The point of including this, you remember when I was talking right at the outset about French and Italian and Spanish imaginings of a world that was out there? Here, this gives you an indication of what I'm talking about. The trees are different. The architecture is different from what Weber would have done of Nootka Sound. It's a magical and fantastic environment in which this puberty scene or coming-of-age celebration is working itself out. These things obviously occurred, but we're sadly thinking that maybe this is not exactly as true to form in accuracy as we would like to know. And this we find in the Sandwich Islands or Hawaiian Islands as well, or in Tahiti. But it's the best we've got, and of course from it, it opens up all sorts of interesting points about the difference between the art that the Navy was bringing to this area and the art that was coming from other sources and other expectations. This is Weber's interpretation of what the various houses at Uquat, the place where the wind blows, and you can see many fine examples of First Nations here. These become more stylized when they're engraved and appear in the voyage account of James Cook, which was published in 1784. And we return happily to the last where we began with this view of George Vancouver's Atlas, because it brings things home full circle. This illustration of the Discovery is an acquisition by the National Maritime Museum of about 8 years ago. It's one of the few contemporary illustrations of the HMS Discovery at that point in time, so I thought I would include that for commentary. And this is Goldstream, Vancouver Island, just to remind us what today's natural landscape of rivers and streams and mountains and rock looks like. And lastly, acknowledgements to Kim Davies, Steve Mayo and Lynn Masland, Tamara Belts, Jeff and Sally, Lincoln and Patty, Marilyn Goff, Spencer Goff, the Wilson Library and History Department of Western Washington University, and thank you very much. Now there are questions, and if there are questions, would you please use this microphone and we'll bring it to you for that purpose.
You mentioned that Cook, when he got up to St. Elias, it was an active volcano. Would a European sea captain likely have encountered active volcanoes in some other part of the world, or would that have been a pretty extraordinary event at that time?
The study of volcanoes was, of course, extremely of great interest to the antiquarians of that age. And my backstory on this, therefore, is Sir William Hamilton, who was the friend of Emma Hamilton, the guardian and, of Emma Hamilton, who was Lord Nelson's girlfriend, right? And he was an antiquarian collecting all sorts of data about Mount Vesuvius. So these people of that age were interested in volcanic eruptions. Throughout the Ring of Fire that goes from East Asia all the way to North America, there's a ring of volcanoes, Mount Hood, Mount St. Helens, Mount Baker, Mount St. Elias, Mount Shasta. These are all, you know, these are all part of the Ring of Fire. So if they can find one that is erupting, in which there's lava flow and there's volcanic ash, this is a subject to celebration. And of course in Kamchatka and Siberia, there were others that they took note of. So, you know, this was a phenomena. The eruption of the volcanoes was a phenomena that they wanted to record as closely as they could. Thank you.
Did they seek out fresh water to kill the marine material on the hull? Was this a common, popular thing by the explorers?
Well, Bob, the best method of looking after the hull was making sure that there was copper sheeting that prevented any worms or other growth from dealing with it. But that having been said, the growth would still continue to appear and lengthen. And so from time to time, young bucks would have to be sent away down below to clear things away, or the ship would have to be careened and hauled and turned on its side so it could be cleaned. The ships always needed washing inside. Good soaps and acids of all sorts were used for fumigation purposes. When James Cook comes to Nootka Sound, he needs wood and he needs water. He needs wood for the stoves. Their next destination is Bering Sea. So they want enough wood on board so they can keep those stoves going so that they can have warm food. They can cook their food. And they also need the water, of course, for purposes of drinking as well as cooking. So they sent the butts ashore to fill, and Nootka Sound happened to have good water there. So all of those things were dandy for them. Now, Cook does go to near Anchorage today, and they resupply there. But the essential thing is that those ships had been 3.5 weeks or 4 weeks from Hawaii, so that would deplete the water and wood supply very, very quickly. As to using water on cleaning the hull, fresh water would be good because it would keep off the salt as much as possible. Scrubbing down the decks was a common thing. Holystoning the decks to keep them clean was important to prevent the cracks between the pieces of wood from getting mold in them or opening up with freezing water, freezing rain. So all of that had to be taken into account. Thank you.
I know that the motor vessel Uchuk goes up as a supply vessel into Nootka Sound, and is there anything to see if you take that trip?
Yes, and it's well worth taking the trip to Nootka Sound. You can go there for a day, just as you described. There are several historic markers. The government of Spain, the Washington State Historical Society, Parks Canada have all put up memorials indicating the locations. There is a big lighthouse there, and the lighthouse keeper is really the curator of history there. It's all on Indian Reserve Number 1. So the First Nations of the Nuchalmouth, they're the Moashat and the Mushalat are the two native bands there. And they have really, sadly to my way of thinking, declined any attempt to establish a museum there which might make it their history more open to the outside world. They have seen the intruders come and they want to make sure that they leave. And they're not keen to explore that kind of history directly with having a museum there. I find that oddly paradoxical, because I would have thought that they would want to have shown to the outside world how unique and how important it is. But this is IR number 1, Indian Reserve number 1, and they're very defensive and very protective about making that into a place of public display. So we live with that. We have to live with that. In 1978, we had the wonderful Captain Cook Bicentenary exhibition and conference at Simon Fraser University. When my friend Bernard Smith was there, I was there, Andrew David, the famous cartographer, was there, Sir James Watt, who's the expert on naval medicine. We were all there giving papers. And they wanted to take an expedition to go to Nootka Sound to see it on the spot, and the First Nations denied them access to it. So there's a tight dividing line in history, isn't it? You know, we are interested in your history. We would like to see it, but unless you can allow us to do that, we're not going to be able to see it. On their point of view, we know what our history is. We want to keep it that way. We don't want any further Spanish, English, Americans, or others coming here for that purpose. I leave it there. I can't comment on it further. It's for somebody who's worked in my life in education and thinks that the sharing of information is an important thing. We have, in this case, a great divide. I'll give you another example. In 1793, the great Sir Alexander Mackenzie made his famous voyage right across to Dean Channel in the middle latitudes of British Columbia. Jim Smithers, who was a recreational instructor at Lakehead University, arranged for his students in canoes to retrace Mackenzie's route, and they hoped and expected to get to Dean Channel. When they got to the upper reaches of the Dean River, there was an Indian roadblock. They'd known that Jim Smithers and the students were coming. Phone message went back to the president of the university, what should we do? The result was, discretion is the better part of valor. We're not going to encroach upon native space here. So they turned around and they weren't able to complete that overland voyage 200 years after Mackenzie. I find that very sad, but it's a political statement. It was a political statement that was made by those people at that point in time. They've got a right to do that. But at the end of the day, it's not a very happy result. So I must leave it at that. Thank you for the question.
They're sailing northwest from my experience on the other side of the island, they're sailing against strong northwesterly winds. And very seldom do you get a wind from the southwest. these boats must have moved very slowly because they couldn't point in the way that we point now. And so how long does it take them to get from, say, somewhere near Tofino
Well,
up to there? Because it's about, what, 50, 60 miles?
that's correct. Their ability to point within 35 degrees of the main line of the vessel would be magical, right? I'll give you the details. James Cook hits the Oregon coast at Cape Blanco on the 5th of March, and it's not until the 28th of March, so that's 23 days later, that he enters Nootka Sound. And it was back and forth, back and forth. And he was against heavy gales through a lot of that period of time. And because he was facing heavy gales, that meant he wanted to keep well off the coast. Cook said that people who sailed with Cook said that he could almost smell the land over the horizon. He had a sense about it, that it was there. But caution for a commander like James Cook was the rule. And so he had to keep, well offshore, and particularly at night. He might come during the day, he might come inshore for some observations to see if there was a land there or mountains or a passageway or whatever, but invariably he kept offshore. But from the 5th of March to the 28th of March, he goes up through several degrees of latitude and finally gets to Nootka Sound. But that's an indication, just as you say, of the power of the winds that he was facing against him. Now remember that what I said earlier, that most of the exploration discoveries had been made on southerly passages. It's exactly for the same reason, because in southerly passages you could get closer in, depending on the weather of course, but that was the time to come in to face the northwest coast. You had the advantages of wind and weather to be able to make your discoveries. And that's why Barclay, this is why Duncan, this is why the Spanish who follow on, Quimper and Valdez, and George Vancouver is an exception incidentally, but Gray and Kendrick, they're all making their passages from north to south. Isn't that interesting? Because we usually think, given the nature of our geography, that these discoveries would be made by people going north. But in point of fact, the best way of doing it is going up to the Gulf of Alaska and then working our way south. Well, thank you for that question, and thank you for the others. Western Washington University Bookstore has got books over there to sell, and I'm going to go over and help them do that. So thank you very much.